All right, we are at 10:30. Welcome everybody to the amendments to Michigan's Youth Employment Standards Act. Um, so with us today, we have Mike Blum from Foster Swift. Most of you may know Mike. He is the superhero labor lawyer from Foster Swift who helps an awful lot of libraries here in Michigan and also helps us at LM as well. Mike, I'm going to let you take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Claire, and welcome, and thank you for joining us this morning to review the amendments to the Michigan Youth Employment Standards Act, which I will be referring to as YESA. Hopefully, these changes will be a little clearer and a little easier to understand than what we went through with ESTA, which I think we're still working through a little bit. But what I wanted to do this morning is just to make sure everybody understands where we came from, where we're at, and where we're going, because there's issues to this on all of that. And I would also like to thank the Library of Michigan for hosting this presentation. These are always helpful, I think. So thanks, Claire, and thank you to the Library of Michigan for hosting this. So let's start by discussing where we came from. And to do that, we need to go back to 1978 when the YESA was first came into existence. And the purpose in 1978 to pass YESA was to try to protect minors in the workplace and put that phrase in the workplace in quotes because that's going to be somewhat significant on what we talk about today. But the way the legislature tried to accomplish protecting minors by passing YESA was a number of things. One, by regulating the hours that minors can work. And again, put that word work in quotes. By regulating the conditions under which minors can work. And what we'll talk about quite a bit today is requiring work permits for youth entering into employment, and then establishing the responsibilities of both the employer and the State Department, in this case, currently Leo. That's changed a little bit in what it's called basically through the years, but it's currently the Leo. And that was the idea in 1978, is get Leo involved, put responsibilities on the employers to make sure that employees that enter into workplaces are protected. So the question becomes, what is a minor? A minor, this is kind of a bright line. A minor is somebody who is less than 18 years old. So a lot of times you'll see exceptions and whatnot. There's a few exceptions here in certain industries, but for the most part, it is anybody under 18 that we're talking about. And what we'll see a little bit later is there's brackets. There's 16 and 17-year-olds, there's 15 and 16-year-olds, and then there's let me start. There's 16 and 17 is a high end. There's 14 and 15, which is a low end, and then under 14, which won't affect libraries for the most part, but there's exceptions made for those under 14. So we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail as well. But I think it's significant to understand that YESA covers more than just employees. The word employment is pretty broad under YESA, and it covers, in addition to paid employees, covers volunteers, covers independent contractors, it covers those in the performing arts. So basically, anybody that comes into contact with the libraries that is under 18 years old, the library has to make sure that you're aware of YESA and in compliance with it. So it's a pretty broad-based requirement. So that's where we came from. Let's talk about where we're going. And that is what currently is called the Public Act 196 of 2024. This started with House Bill 5594, and the numbers aren't that critical, but if you were watching this or tracking this, it came through as House Bill 5594, which was signed by the governor and became PA 196, which became effective April 2nd of this year. So there's some confusion that comes in because some of the requirements are effective April 2nd, meaning they're already in place and you have to be aware of them because they're current. Some of them don't take effect for 18 months. And so we'll go through the differences there. But what BA 196 basically did is it made some significant changes to the procedures for issuing work permits. It modifies the hours primarily for those under 16 that they're allowed to work. There's some significant changes that were made there. And those changes have been in place since April 2nd. So you need to watch what you're doing. If you have any minor as an employee or a volunteer that's under 16, you got to be aware of the new hours that are in effect right now. And there's also issue that was in the original law and remains that there's circumstances under which deviations can be granted. I don't think they're going to affect libraries. And if it does, in rare circumstances, but I have flagged that just so that people are aware of what deviations under YESA are. So that gets us to work permits. And I guess the question becomes, or the question I get asked quite a bit actually, is who needs a work permit? And what I have here is basically a screenshot out of Leo's website. And as you can see, it says any minor who is 11 or up to 18. That's what Leo's website says. Again, for libraries, the minimum basically is 14 because some of the ones under 14 are going to be if you're 11 years old, you can be a golf or bridge caddy. I don't think too many libraries employ bridge caddies. A minor of 13 can be employed in farm operations or setting traps or trap ski. So if you're seeing anything that says that YESA allows employment of 11, 12, and 13-year-olds, you have to step back and say, does that affect the library? And the answer is generally, almost always, no. And I have seen policies actually that I fortunately have not drafted, but I've seen them. I don't know where they came from, but that has said you can volunteer as you can volunteer for the library once you're 11 or 12. I've seen them, 11, 12, 13, and I've gotten calls and they say, we have people here volunteering that are under 14. So you have a problem. You can't do that. So you have to make sure that if you hear that the law says 11 to 13 can be employed, the, these are the limited circumstances you can do that. So under the original law, PA 90 of 1978, the work permits, which were the ones that are being amended, but have not changed as of April 2nd. So these requirements currently are still in place. What the work permits for the minors are issued and revoked by the chief administrator or the authorized designee of the school district or the intermediate school district or the public school academy or a non-public school. So it's across the board. The questions I've been getting are, what about homeschooling? The rules don't change. Homeschooling, is obviously much more prevalent than it was in 1978, and I don't even know if it was done much at all in 1978. But the rules are the same. If the home is in the school district, these requirements apply even if the youth is being homeschooled. So I get calls like that periodically, and you still have to comply with these requirements, even for the employee or the volunteer that is being homeschooled. The work permits have to be issued by the school and then kept on file both at the library and becomes part of the employment record in the school. That's where it is kept currently. Then after termination, the library, as the employer, has to send the work permit back to the school so they know that employment has ended. They have to reflect that in the education record, and that's how it is currently done. That's what's going to change significantly that we'll talk about. In yeah, in 18 months, or as of October 2nd of 2026, which is 18 months from the effective date, the responsibility for issuing and revoking work permits is being transferred to Leo. And there's always been a provision, I think, in YESA for revoking, but that I think takes increased emphasis in the way this is going to be administered in October of next year. A couple of critical things here, I think. First, the minors must register with Leo before they can start working for the library or volunteering for the library. So the minor will have to go to Leo and register. And how that's done is how I'll end this. I've had several slides on what's going to be the new registration process. But the minor is going to have to register before they can do anything in the way of employment with the library. And I think probably the most significant change here is that the employer, the library as an employer, that wants to employ a minor or allow the minor to volunteer must be authorized by Leo. So you can't have a situation where somebody walks in, I'd love to work here. Oh, great. Go to school, get your work permit, and away you go. It's not going to be that simple anymore because the individual is going to have registered with Leo, and the library is going to have already been authorized by Leo and included in a website or a database that they're going to keep on their website. And again, we'll talk about all those details. It's going to be pretty specific on what has to happen. If that hasn't happened, then you can't use the individual either as an employee or a volunteer. So I think those are going to be the biggest, most significant changes we're going to see in how this is administrative changes are going to affect the libraries. And then the last bullet point is really not a big change other than when you terminate the employee, instead of notifying the school, you have to notify Leo. They're going to put it in their database and it's going to show up on the website. So there are exceptions for work permits. And I have received through the years many questions on this exact issue here because they say, well, not everybody needs a work permit. That's correct. There is a provision in YESA that says a minor who is performing work as an unpaid volunteer for an organization that is recognized as a tax exempt do not need a work permit. So I get calls. I said, well, we're a public library. We don't pay federal taxes. We don't make profits. We're exempt. So why do I need a work permit? And the answer to that is simply because a library may not be required to pay federal taxes doesn't get you where you need to go. The reason why the libraries generally do not have to pay taxes is because they're a government entity, not because they are a tax exempt organization under the Internal Revenue Code.
Hey, Mike, so I have a question about that's pertinent to this. There are libraries in the state that are 501c3s.
Yep.
But my understanding is that the 501c3 doesn't override their government entity status. So in that situation, what's what's the answer there? Do they need it or not?
Well, the that's an excellent point, Claire, and I'm glad you jumped in because I was going to uh, shift this over to you in a second. The simple fact that somebody is a 501c3 doesn't necessarily mean they come under the exemption for the work permit. It may get you there, but you have to look at the reasons for the exemption, which are the under the Internal Revenue Code, the purposes, structure, and activities that is described in the Internal Revenue Code. So this gets a little complicated,
Right,
probably beyond the scope of what we're here to talk about today. But
right.
I wanted to raise it because you see this a lot. And then,
Yep.
Claire, what I was going to do is shift this over to you because there is an excellent summary on this issue that has been authored by Claire and posted on the Library of Michigan website. And the link is there. So
So,
Claire, you might want to talk about that a little bit. Just let them know what that is. I don't want
oh,
to steal your thunder here.
no, 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 no. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. It's just a an info sheet that discusses, why a library might want to be a 501c3, how a library is able to uh, be a 501c3. So it just kind of goes into what Mike was just talking about, but a little bit more in depth in terms of, the purposes of a 501c3 in a library and why a library might qualify. Um, so it seems to me that Jocelyn's question in the chat that says if an 11 to 13-year-old is being required to get volunteer hours for school or another organization, which comes up a lot, they cannot, it would seem to me they cannot do those volunteer hours at the library. They would have to do it somewhere else.
Yeah, I agree because if we go back to the slide where I showed you where that comes in, and I don't want to
Right,
make anybody dizzy, but let me get back to this. If you want to volunteer as and you're under 14, you can do it, but only if for the golf or bridge caddies, or in the farm operations, or one of these exceptions. The
right,
fact that you're getting it for the reason why you're getting it isn't what gets us into the exception. It's what you're doing.
right. Right. Now, actually, T actually posed a very clever question. If the Friends of the Library is a 501c3 organization, then presumably they would fit under that exception of a tax exempt organization, and a student may be able, that age may be able to volunteer under the Friends of the Library rather than the library itself.
Well, keep in mind that the Friends is a separate legal entity.
Exactly.
So the requirements for the Friends and for the library itself may well be different. They're different legal entities. So I
Right.
think the issue of whether the exemption under the Internal Revenue Code is applicable, that test is going to have to be applied to whoever wants to claim the exemption. So if the library doesn't meet it, but the Friends does, then I would agree with that. If the Friends meets the requirements under the Internal Revenue Code, for the purpose, structure, and activities,
Mhm.
then yes, then they could have a volunteer without the requirement for a work permit. But that's going to be dependent on the Friends being properly classified
Right.
under this exception.
Right.
So
And
again, where this is not for the Friends, and I
no,
don't want to give the
right.
Friends legal
Absolutely.
advice, but
Absolutely.
if they are properly under this exception, I would agree with that.
And you want to be really careful as a library because I know out there's a lot of gray lines between libraries and friends. So the library wants to be extremely careful there. It can't be that the friends takes on the student as a volunteer, but then they're really a library volunteer. So you want to make sure the friends talk to their attorney about that. You want to be really careful about that.
Right. And I would just caution against trying to get around this by having the friends bring in the volunteer and then shift the individual over for duties in the
Yeah,
library, I think that's going to cause some problems.
absolutely.
Okay, anything else on this
That
issue?
that's it for now.
Okay, then let's at this point shift focus into some of the more substantive issues that are in place currently. And that is the restrictions on the hours for the minors, where we just came out of. So this slide is now old. It's not in effect anymore. Under the 1978 law, the 14 or 15-year-old minor cannot work, and it was you can see it's pretty general, but it gives you the specifics on the 7 to 9, more than 6 days in a week, or 48 um, weekly average. So you can see what the old restrictions are, and then it used a combined school and work week of 48 hours. That's all gone. They changed that so that, and I don't know if it's better or worse, more restrictive, or I haven't really looked at it that way. I think what they did, though, is they tried to look at definitive dates. And the Labor Day is the key that they focused on. So they look at the periods from June 1st to Labor Day to give you a bright line rule during that period. And then another bright line rule for the rest of the year. So they expanded the hours if you're from June 1st to Labor Day. They kept it at the 7 to 7 for the rest of the year. So they're focusing on, the school year. But the problem with the school year, which was the old law, is the school year for different schools is different. So
Hmm.
I think the idea was to get a more bright line guidance for this. So now you can look at the calendar, figure out what you can do.
Um,
And then they also changed a little bit on the requirements per day and per week. The new current rules are more than 3 hours in a day, can't work on more than 3 hours in a day, or 18 in a week. And here they did stay to while the school is in session. So that's still tied to the school that they're in. So you have to might maybe talk to the school about that. But then outside of that, well, what they did is they went to the 40-hour per week, but they eliminated the daily limit when the school is not in session, which surprised me a little bit, but they removed that restriction.
Mike, so I was working on an info sheet for this and I passed it through my team here and I got a couple good questions from that. It didn't occur to me. Someone in my office said, how would this work if the school has to extend its year for snow days, or is it and is this based on the job where the job is or where the school where the student attends? I'm assuming it's the school the student attends, but um, so does this matter if the school extends its period for snow days? It goes longer than you know, starts before Labor Day, or so these dates are static even if regardless of the school's actual schedule.
I think the first two bullet points, it's not tied to the school's session.
Okay.
So your 7 to 9 or 7 to 7 restrictions are calendar based.
Okay. And
But if
and
you get into the third and fourth bullet points, you do got to go to the school that the student or the volunteer or the employee is in, or and Chloe, you said they attend, and I want to get back to homeschool. So if
right.
it's a homeschool, it's the school district in which they live.
Okay.
So you got to be a little bit careful on that attend, but
Ah,
they either attend or the school district in which they live. And then I think that the if the session was extended, I think it's still going to be the school is in session. So I think that this 3 day per day and 18-hour per week during the extended session is still going to be applicable.
Okay. And we're getting a couple questions about, and this occurred to me too, and I was going to address it at the end, but we're getting multiple questions on it. If you have parents volunteer with the student who is under the age of 14, do they need a work permit?
The parent or the under the
The
age 14
student.
student?
So if a parent goes with the student and volunteers at the library with the student,
That's an interesting question. The student under 14 cannot be a
yeah.
volunteer. The parent, I suppose, can be a volunteer. I don't know in that scenario what the student is doing.
Okay. Okay.
If the student is actually acting as a volunteer, I don't think that's permitted.
Okay.
If the student is there because the parent is volunteering, I think that's going to get you into the um, library policies. Do you have, I mean, like yesterday, I think was bring your uh, uh, child to work program or
Mm-hmm.
day or whatever they call it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you're bringing the youth with you and that's
Right.
permitted, they're not acting as a volunteer.
Right.
But if they're acting as a volunteer, I think you have a problem.
Okay. So for libraries out there, as Michelle says, we have whole families volunteer. That's okay if you have like the whole family doing it as a family event. But if the parent is coming with the child so the child can gain hours for a school requirement, that's not okay.
Yeah, that's an interesting question and kind of nuanced, but I don't think that there's going to be an exception for a youth under 14
Right.
performing volunteer services.
You're right. And as far as dates, as Mike said, the act, depending on different parts of it, are in effect at some different times. The registration parts, and those major changes are not going to affect until October 2nd, 2026. But these hours changes are in effect as of April 2nd of this year. So they're already in effect. Okay, I think that covers it.
Yeah. And so that raises an interesting question because if you have somebody that is working or volunteering currently that has been there presumably since the beginning of the school year, what happens? Does that mean that your work permit is no longer valid? And the answer to that is no, that's still valid because that's where the 18-month rule comes in. But do you have to change their work or volunteer schedule because of the amendments to the law? And the answer to that is yes. That has to come into compliance. So it's a two-step compliance. Okay. Anything else on that, Claire?
Nope, we're good.
It looks like your staff has been working on this, so we've got some expert questions here. That's good. Now, on the issue of deviations, um, and where deviations comes in is you have the hour restrictions, but in some industries or in some circumstances, uh, that might not fit the needs, both of the community and of the individuals involved. So there's always been a process where, and this was always deviation that was uh, authorized by the government. So you could go and you could get a deviation from those rules. That is still there. But what is changing is that when deviations can be provided. And I think the biggest key is and I don't know why there must have been a problem somewhere because they took away from Leo the authority to provide a deviation for those 14 and 15. to work outside of the 7 to 9. That 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. is new in the amendments, and they said that is set in stone. There cannot be deviations. Now, there's other deviations that can be given, and I don't have it on the slide, but it's in the uh, bill that became the law, and there's the parents have much more control over these deviations than they did previously, because if even now, if a request for a deviation goes to Leo and Leo says, makes sense to us, if the parent says, no, we don't agree with the deviation, that deviation cannot apply. So those are general issues here, but I don't think that the what hours we're talking about here, unless there's something unique going on, that it's going to affect the libraries. But I did want to flag this just in case you hear or anybody is out there and they hear, well, these hours don't work for you, just go get a deviation. Yeah, maybe, but you have to be careful with what can and cannot be given a deviation. Now we're getting into some of the detail. And the detail is going to be the new requirements. And this is what you're going to have to be living with. You got a little bit of time to get there, but it's going to be a significant change. And I think this is the going to be the biggest change that everybody's going to have to get used to. So what's going to happen in 18 months is that, and the reason for the 18 months, I think, is that Leo has a lot of work to do. They have to create a online registration because that does not currently exist. So they have to create an online registration, and they have to not only create it, but they have to maintain it and make it free to the public. So this is something that the legislature has placed on the agency, that they have to create, maintain, and run a system of registration that's going to replace what previously has been done in the school districts. So that's why the 18 months. This is what's going to happen in the next 18 months. And so some of the detail is that what Leo must do is must create this registration system that the minor or a parent or legal guardian of the minor has to be able to go into this system, this online registration system. And this is where the minor will be registered. So that is in the works. How difficult, how easy it's going to be. It's supposed to be easy. We'll see. I'm always nervous about new IT systems, and you go in and how smooth this is going to be. But that's in the works. And from the parents' standpoint, and the parents are probably going to be helping the minors in this, is they're going to have to figure out how to get into, use, and register in the brand new registration system that's being created. And then it also is going to have, probably in the same place or same page or different page or however they set it up, is the library as the employer is going to have to go in and register to be able to employ the minors. So you got two different things going on here at the same time. You've got a website that's being created so that the minor can go in and say, I want to work or volunteer. Separately, the employer has to go in and say, I would like to be able to use a minor as an employee or a volunteer. And if both of those aren't done, you can't have a match. You can't connect the dots. There is an exception to that, depending on if Leo doesn't do their job. But that's how this is intended to work. So then what's going to happen, and there's quite a bit of information that has to be provided here. The minor or their parent or guardian has to go into the system. They have to give the minor's name, age, home address, and contact information. I apologize for the typo. It says contact. It's supposed to be contact information. And that's the minor's age. So that's some information that when I first looked at that, I thought, oh, there's some parents that probably aren't going to be real comfortable putting this in a public domain. But the idea is this is not going to be public information. And I do have a slide later that says, what if we get a FOIA request for this? And this information is going to be exempt from FOIA. So it's information that's going into Leo's database, but at least in theory, will not become public. But that's some detailed information, not only about the parent or the legal guardian, but also about the minor specifically. And then, and this is probably jumps into the accommodation requirements, both for employees and for student rights. But when the registration is done, it has to identify any physical limitation of the minor. So again, that's pretty personal information to the individual that has to be produced at this time. What I find interesting here, and Claire, maybe you or your staff have heard anything about this. It says identification of any physical limitation of the minor. The accommodation issues that I'm used to go to physical and mental. I don't know why this has physical only. You have any thoughts on that?
I kn My understanding is that a lot of this was initiated because of trying to bring it in compliance with the federal child labor laws, but no, that particular thing I don't. And like I said, I contacted Sean at Leo, who was the guy you probably know, Sean, the
Yep.
the guy, and he like apologized to me. He told me they've been so inundated with ESTA that they really haven't had a chance to really do this yet. So he didn't have anything, he couldn't tell me anything. And they have not had anything on their website. So this also, I have questions about this as well because it just doesn't seem, it seems odd when with everything you know about like ADA stuff.
Yeah. So, and that's my thought. I think it's probably, and I don't know about an oversight, but you're right. There was a lot going on in drafting, and maybe it was just missed or whatnot. And Claire, you make a good point because there are two requirements. There's a federal requirement, and then there's a state requirement. The rule is you have to comply with the one that provides the most protections,
Hmm.
which generally is going to be the state law.
Hmm.
So I think that following YESA, currently and as it's being amended, gets you in compliance with the federal law. But if there's a difference, and I'm not aware of any differences, but both laws do apply, but it's whichever one provides the most protections. So with that
Hmm.
said, we also have the identification of physical limitations. Unless this changes or gets more guidance from Leo, I would comply as written. But in practice, I wouldn't limit accommodations to physical
Hmm.
because on any accommodations, whether it's in employment, whether it's student rights under the school laws or whatnot, if you limit it to physical limitations, I think you're going to have a big problem. So
And
for registration, it's one thing. What you do as an employer is, I think, possibly different here. I guess that's the
and
best thought I have.
yeah. Well, and I'm hoping Leo can give us a little more detail because with, as you know, with ADA, a lot of times you don't acknowledge it at all unless it's obvious or the person has requested the accommodation, because then you can get into like the discrimination area.
Right.
So that's weird too, that they want you to identify it up front. Some people might not want to.
Yeah, and normally I find that that's an excellent point because, for instance, if you have an application for employment, and basically this is a registration for employment, and if you have on your application, do you have any physical limitations? You're going to be in trouble. But here they're basically telling you to do just that. So I don't know. I mean, it's going to be a requirement. I think you're going to have to comply with it. I don't know what if it's not disclosed and that comes out down the road, how that's going to play out, I'm not sure. But I think we have to work with Leo and maybe talk to Sean a little bit more and see what they actually plan on doing this. Because if you have the minor and the parent register, and then you get the student, the youth, in as a volunteer and employee, and then you get a request for accommodation for a physical limitation that wasn't disclosed, what happens? And I don't
Right.
know the answer to that. That's on our to-do list, Clara.
Right, right.
Okay, then next on the Leo registration requirements, the system, uh, once the minor registers for employment, so the minor says, I want to work for X library. The system will automatically notify the library. Now, I assume this is going to be AI, or I'm not sure how they're going to do it. I doubt that there's going to be a person responsible for this, so I don't know exactly how they're going to set this up, but I think it's going to be an automatic trigger when somebody identifies Leo that they would like to work for the library. That will automatically trigger a notice to the library. And then once the library gets that notice, there's a number of things the library is going to have to do before they can let that person start working. First, they're going to have to provide to Leo the library's name and contact information, the minor's name and contact information. So I'm not really sure they already have that. They have the minor going in and saying, I want to work for this library, but now they're putting on the library the requirement for the minor's name and contact information. So I assume that, or at least Leo is assuming, the legislature is assuming that there's already been discussion between the library and the youth on employment. And now separately, they contact Leo. So that seems to be duplicative, but it's required. And then you have to have the address of each of the employer's work sites. For libraries, this might not be a big issue for a lot of the libraries, but what I'm thinking is maybe district libraries. They might have a number of different library branches or whatnot. So even though you're going to have the minor only at one branch, you're going to have to disclose to Leo every single branch in the system. And then what they're going to be looking at here is they're going to be looking at, okay, have you employed minors before? And how have you been doing? Are you complying with the law? I think that's a reason for this. I said the name of each minor currently employed. So are you already using the minors? And if so, who? And then this I find very interesting. It requires a signed statement made under penalty of perjury that the employer will comply with all applicable youth employment laws. So just step back on that. The law, I mean, since 78, there's been a law that says you have to comply with certain requirements. And if you don't, there's penalties. And the penalties basically, I don't want to get into all the penalties here, but they're basically written as if you don't comply with the requirements for the employment of minors, generally it's considered to be a misdemeanor. It could result in a fine. If it's intentional or repeated or whatnot, it could elevate to a felony or whatnot, but just penalties written right into the statute. What this does is it says not only are you subject to the penalties under YESA, but now you can be prosecuted for perjury because you said that you would comply with YESA. You didn't, so you violate YESA and you perjured yourself. And that to me is a little disconcerting. Blair, do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm sorry, I was answering a question. What was the question?
I'm a little bit concerned with this requirement of the signed statement made under penalty of perjury that the
Yes.
library will comply because you always have the penalties under the statute, in this case, YESA, which could be misdemeanor, it could be
Hmm.
felony, generally misdemeanor, a fine or whatnot. Here, it looks like the legislature is saying if you violate YESA, not only are you subject to the penalties under YESA, we can prosecute you for perjury
Oh,
because you
yeah.
signed a statement saying that you would follow the law and you didn't. So not only are you subject to the statutory penalties, but you might be subject to prosecution for perjury. To me, that's a
Yeah.
little disconcerting.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I absolutely agree with that. There's some other um questions here about, so could you do kind of differentiate between um if you have a program at the library where, let's say, you're making crafts that you're going to donate to the senior center, that, you invite, it's just a regular library program and kids come, as opposed to an actual volunteer opportunity where a kid comes either to satisfy requirements for school, which may only take one session, or an ongoing, um, like part of a teen advocacy board or something, or advisory board, where it's a commitment that the student comes over and over again. Like, but it seems there's a difference between a program that may benefit somebody else, so, could be volunteering, but it's, not, and a program that, and a child or a student who needs volunteer hours for a school requirement, and maybe they only need, 5 hours, which could be done in one session, but that's still volunteering because the library has to verify that they're volunteering. And, a volunteer position that a student takes where they're there repeatedly.
Oh, that's that's getting a little bit nuanced on the issues
I
here.
know, but
That's
there
an
are
excellent
libraries
question. It's an
where,
excellent question, and I think it's going to be fact specific on how it's set up. But my initial thought is that yes, is looking at a relationship between a an employer, in this case, a library, and a youth. And if the
yes.
relationship is employment based, which can be actual paid employment or unpaid, which is where a volunteer comes in,
Hmm.
then that's what a volunteer is. It's an unpaid employee, is basically what it is. And so that gives a relationship between the minor and the library that triggers all of these requirements. And it puts a certain amount of control by the library over the individual performing the work or the services, following the rules, all of that. You might have
Hmm.
programs that are available to the public. And I'm just thinking out loud here,
Hmm.
so don't hold me to this because I think we're going to have
Right.
to see how this develops. But I'm thinking that if you have a program, you put that program together, the library puts the program together, they have employees working on the program, they could have established volunteers working with the employees on aspects of the program to develop the program.
Hmm.
Then you roll out the program is up and running. Now you have people from the public. It can include students from wherever or whatnot participating in the program. I don't think that's volunteering.
What if
Um,
the library needs to certify that the student put in volunteer hours?
yeah, that's a great question. I guess it depends on what they're volunteering and
Yeah,
how.
yeah.
I'd have to think about that. Do you have any thoughts on that, Claire?
It seems to me that if the library has to certify that a student put in time volunteering for service hours, then that would seem to me to fall under volunteering.
yeah, that's
But
where
if
I'm. Yeah,
but if it's just a kid attending a program, even though that program may seem like maybe like you said, an individual program open to the public where a kid comes and makes something for a homeless person but it's a library program, I don't think that would be volunteering.
yeah, that's what I'm thinking too. Because and it's the volunteer. What are you doing as a volunteer?
Right.
And I think we can jump back. Maybe I hate to do this, but and you look at ESTA. ESTA is definition of employee, and we can use the same for volunteer, is that you perform services or activities for the library in the interest of the library. If that's what you're doing, if you are giving your time to the library for programs in the interest of the library, I think you're going to fit into the definition of the volunteer, and then I think you have to follow YESA. If it is simply, for instance, we're getting a little off base here, maybe just
Right.
too far down the rabbit hole, I say, but then you put this program together and then you get a bunch of students in, and then you have refreshments, and somebody has to, oh, could you go get a cookie off that
Hmm.
um, stand somewhere,
Right.
or whatever. Oh yeah, I can go get that. Is that volunteer service? No.
No.
So I
No.
think depends on where you're drawing the lines
I
here. But
agree.
if you are providing your time for activities for the library in the interest of programs put on by the library, I think you're a volunteer.
And if the library is certifying that you are
Yes,
volunteering. Yeah. So
absolutely.
so Jocelyn, I think that if you're offering volunteer hours for uh, teens to attend programs, I think that's kind of a dangerous area to be in terms of this.
Yeah. And I guess the other thought I have
So
on that,
I would talk, yeah, you might want to talk to your attorney about that, but the sense is I and see what Mike says, I would be really leery of the library, you know, verifying volunteer hours for teens attending a program under this.
yeah, and the devil might be in the detail, as they say. So
Right,
it could be fact based, but
right,
if the 30,000 foot view is complying with YESA, will eliminate the issues.
right,
If
right.
you're wrong, if you have somebody, you certify the hours, you did not follow the volunteer requirements under what will be the new YESA rules, and Leo determines that you were supposed to, now you're subject potentially to criminal fines that you could
Right.
have easily avoided by following the registration process.
So Dickinson has an interesting question. Again, this is getting a little bit into the weeds, so we may have to just something to deal with, separately. But so if the library has a volunteer who is placed at that site by the local courts for work hours, is a work permit needed by the library? Now, wouldn't that depend on who is the employer there?
Yeah, and I have seen these, and when you get into uh, time, volunteer time for court ordered probation, I think that's beyond YESA.
Yeah,
And I think there's some significant issues there. And I have had these issues, but the requirements for taking people in, to comply with their court-ordered um, service for probation, but I don't think you get out from under YESA if
Right.
it's truly volunteer work. So I think there's going to be a lot of details, but I think you can tell the court that yes, we will do it, but we're going to treat this as a volunteer. You'd have to see the court order, you'd have to see the
Yeah.
circumstances.
Yeah.
The other issue is when you're talking in the criminal law, and we're talking youth. So now you're talking
Right.
about a lot of privacy issues and
Hmm.
whatnot. So that's going to get into a lot of
Yeah.
touchy issues
Yeah. And
because with the youth, and this isn't the normal criminal court, it's going to be the youth rules and whatnot. So you got to be a little bit careful. But simply saying that the person needs volunteer time for court ordered
mhm,
probation, I'd step back and see what you're dealing with.
right. And some of the answers of this too, and maybe this is going to sound radical, is going back to some of the exceptions where, if it's a nonprofit or it may be that in some of these instances, the library is not the place for these people to be for some of these reasons. Because, out there in the world, in the non-library land, there's a lot of confusion about what a library is and where a
Hmm.
library fits, right? And so a library is not a nonprofit. A library is not. So, there may be some, as you go along, fact-based things, adjustment things that libraries may find in the end that some of these things are, what, the library may not be the best place for this volunteering to occur.
Right.
And that's hard, but that's an analysis that may be between the library and their attorney and their board is something that, you may have to consider as we go through all this.
And the other issue I have, and I've actually had this a few times, is now you're talking about somebody that is in the criminal justice system. They have been presumably convicted of something and now want to get into the workplace to perform services. What did the individual do? Is that an individual that you want? If it's an employee, particularly if it's a adult employee and you run your background check, you pick this up. You might not hire that individual depending on what they did.
Hmm.
So to simply say we will allow this individual into the library, knowing that there's some criminal conduct involved without knowing what it is, I think you might have issues of negligence involved. I think you got to be a little bit concerned with knowing what the individual did and what you're allowing them to do and who they come into contact with, because just by way of example, what if it's some sexual misconduct issue, and now they're in the library in the youth section
Hmm.
or the children's section. Um, what do you do with that? That's why I say there's a lot of issues here, but I wouldn't simply say the court needs this individual to get hours. We can give them hours. I don't think it's that easy.
Right, right. And okay, Jody asks, so if your library building is owned by township government and they are responsible for all of your library building and the grounds, if a youth group or scouts group that wants to do grounds cleanup each spring and fall, are the work permits for that the responsibility of the library or the township?
It's going to depend who the common law employer is.
Right,
If the township is a common law employer, it'd be the township.
right,
If the library, whether it's a district library or a B164 library or
right.
whatnot, if you are, the issue becomes, are you the common law employer? And if you're the common law employer, the responsibility is yours.
So
If you're not the common law employer, then no,
right.
it's
So
the townships.
so whoever is directing the volunteers. Yeah, yeah,
Whoever, and in the employment, whoever employs the employees
right.
or is responsible for the volunteers would be the one that needs to comply.
Okay. All right. I think we're good for now. Sorry, we brought you
Okay.
off track.
Yeah, that's quite all right. Interesting question.
Well, and
Some really, really good questions. And
as one,
actually, we have 18 months, I guess, to look at this
yeah,
and on and work with Leo or whatnot. So hopefully there's going to be some FAQs coming out on some of these.
yes.
I think this is excellent. I think this will
Yeah.
help us develop the FAQs.
And we'll
So I really
revisit
appreciate the
this too.
questions.
As time goes on, Mike, as we get closer, we'll ask you to come back and we'll probably talk about this in the directors' meetings too.
Okay,
Um,
I'd be happy to because I'm obviously going to be watching this
yep,
as we develop this registration system.
yep. And one participant mentioned, that, hey, this is really how libraries work. So they're very much valuing this discussion with you.
Great. Okay, so let's move to the next slide, which talks about the permit approval. And this, I said when we started, what if Leo simply doesn't do their job? And I'm not suggesting Leo won't do that. I mean, Leo's great. I think Leo does a tremendous job. I think Sean has done a fantastic job with ESTA and whatnot. So I know they have a lot on their plate. But what if you have a situation where um, you have the minor and the employer completes the registration? Everybody does their job. Then what Leo has to do is they have to determine whether the minor's employment would be in compliance. That's why they want all that information. They have to notify the employer, the minor, and the parent or the legal guardian of the determination they made and any deviations that have been requested. This is where the deviations would come in. So the notification comes in and says, the uh, work permit is approved, it's approved subject to the following deviations. This is where the parent could jump in and say, I'm not comfortable with that. And if the parent doesn't agree with the deviation, that's when the parent's um, desires will take precedent over the deviations that would have otherwise been granted by Leo. So the parent has control over that. And then what happens if Leo is swamped or for whatever reason or falls through the cracks or whatever, and they don't do anything? And what the law says is if that's the case, the minor can begin work immediately. So you don't have to wait until you get the work permit issued by Leo when you're waiting for them if they don't do it timely. Now, what happens? I mean, I suppose the question comes in: what if they never issue it? And I don't see anything in the language I've seen that changes that. So I don't know, Claire, have you seen what Leo will do if they can't timely get to it? What their intent is? They probably haven't thought about
Nope. And I don't think they've thought about it yet.
that. So anyways, so the 5 day rule you have that's I guess from the library standpoint. Once you do your job, the person that you want to hire or take in as a volunteer does their job. Everything is in Leo's hands. You have to wait 5 days either for the determination letter, or I guess it'll be electronic, the determination, or you're good with employing. And here is the issue with the database. We talked a little bit about the database earlier, but Leo has to create the database. The database, and this is for employers, for libraries that want out there in public that they are looking for and available to employ youth because the database can include the library's name and address. So this will be up on Leo's website saying so and so library is an employer and is authorized to employ minors under YESA. And that can go out to everybody if you want. You don't have to, but if you want to, you can get that information out there. I suppose it's sort of like free advertising for you.
Mhm.
If you want everybody to know that you're a youth, you want to volunteer or work here, you know, contact us, and that's how you do it. But here is the opposite side of that coin. If Leo determines that the employer is not authorized to employ minors, so if they're seeing problems, they, for whatever reason, they don't want minors working or volunteering in that library, then Leo will immediately remove the employer from the database. So that is I think, a big card that they have, a big, really strong authority. That what if you don't comply with YESA? You have the penalties, but this, I think, is a significant penalty because they can potentially remove you as an employer or a potential employer from the database. And at that point, going forward, you cannot employ any minor or allow any minor to volunteer. So to me, that's a significant penalty that's written into the new law. And I think I mentioned this, but other than the information that the library is an employer and will accept applications from minors, and here's our address. Other than that information, anything that is included in this database is exempt from FOIA. So anybody that gets the FOIA request, contact your attorney or whoever works with you on FOIA. But this is information that not only should not, but cannot be disclosed. And on that one step further on that, Leo is actually restricted by statute. The legislature said to Leo, you can get this information, you can keep it in your database, but you cannot disclose it except as necessary for enforcement of YESA. So you have, and I think has some significance because there's a lot of work share arrangements now between agencies, the various agencies, both state to state, fed to fed, and I think some state to fed agencies now have work share agreements in place. With this restriction, I don't think that this information in Leo's database would be able to be disclosed to even another agency under their work share agreement. And finally, what I have here is some guidance, a number of links, the labor and economic opportunity, the summary for Leo, and I guess I can just jump into that. That's their landing page. That tells you about the original 1978 law. And if you haven't been in this Leo's website, it's pretty good. So that's what that link is. And here's the statement that I already mentioned, that when both federal and state law applies, a more stringent standard must be observed. So you can get your information here. It gives you a bunch of good information here. So you have that link. And then you have this resource rule that this is Leo again. It gives you the probably way more information you need. I just thought I'd help you locate it if you can. So you have the statute, you got the all the executive orders that apply to it. There's a posting requirement. I think everybody knows if the government's involved, there's a statute involved. There's going to be a posting requirement. We saw that um, with ESTA. So they have the youth employment poster here. That's going to be the 78 law. So that will be changing. So this is where you can find that.
And
Here
and
are
I think that might be something that they need to do now, right? I mean, because the hours have changed, so they need to amend their posting,
They
their
should,
post. Yeah.
but like Sean said, I'm sure they're working
Oh
on it.
no, I mean the libraries.
Oh, the library.
They
Yes,
would want to amend their postings right now,
yes.
right?
And here's where you can get some FAQs. Um, I have not actually listened to this recording or these old recordings of 21 and
Mhm.
22. They're probably outdated, but for any historical information, you can get them there. If you want the legislative history, it's probably too much information unless you're like me and you like to track everything.
Me?
This will tell you anything you want to know about this law. But what it gives you is it gives you the analysis
Mhm,
as it progresses. So this tells you this is the 5594, which became PA 196. This tells you how it progressed. And in here, you can actually find all of the changes if you want it.
mhm,
And then last is here is probably and this came out of that
mhm.
legislative
Yep.
analysis. This is prepared by uh, the legislature on summarizing what this law is all about.
Mhm.
So
Yep.
that's probably a lot of information for the moment. I tried to give you the 30,000 foot view, drill into it a little bit. We had some great questions. But Claire, with that, I don't know if there's any other questions, but I
There's
think that's a wrap on what I wanted to cover.
yep, there's two questions here. So would there be a deviation for the number of hours that students can work or, volunteer during winter or spring break? So that falls between, outside of the June to Labor Day, but it's times that school is not in session. So would a library, do you think that you'd be able to get a deviation in hours for, the times that children, kids are off school for a week or so?
For those 15 and younger, no.
Okay.
For those 16 and 17, you can get deviations.
Okay.
So it depends on
Um,
what age group they're in.
gotcha. My nephew visits from out of state in the summer and helps us out with a couple events. Is there a way to handle it for out of state volunteers? And I thought this is kind of a good question, especially for when you get people who, might come into the state or might have or even from another school district who have summer home or who spend a fair amount of time in an area that isn't where they go to school.
Well, if they're in Michigan for the summer and they're performing work or volunteer services in Michigan, Michigan's law would apply. The
Okay.
fact that they live out of state. Now, if it's paid, they would have to be a little bit concerned with the taxes because you can work in another state, but you might have to pay taxes depending on the state tax systems. You may end up with taxing in two different states. You also have, and I don't think in that situation the Michigan library is going to have a problem. But for instance, if you have employees that work out of state and you're in Michigan, you have to register to have employees working out of state. So there's a lot of registration requirements for employees that work out of state. That gets more into the Corporations Act and the taxing issues or whatnot. But if it's all in Michigan, you have somebody that is living in Michigan for the summer, working in the library in Michigan, Michigan law is going to apply.
Okay. So then they would need to bring a work permit with them from their school out of state.
That's a good question, but I think yes.
Okay. Oh, here we go. What happens oh, thank you. Kristen, this was something I meant to mention and I forgot. What happens if the minor turns 18 permit? So in the middle of them turning from 17 to 18, so they have a work permit, they fall under the youth law, but then they turn 18, say mid-year. What happens? Does a switch get turned off and they now are no longer subject to YESA?
Yeah, YESA only applies to minors. So once somebody becomes an adult and they're employed as an adult, the YESA limitations would not apply to an adult.
Okay. Let's see, Mike, is there anything else you want to mention?
Uh, no, I think we've covered quite a bit.
Yeah, as you guys can see, like with most library things, this can get a little complicated. So if you have specific questions about your situation, especially things that might be a little sticky, please touch base with your attorney. Um, because like Mike said, some of the penalties and stuff for this are kind of stiff. And because it's new, we're not really sure exactly what will happen. So make sure that you know what you're doing and you're as best as your attorney can help you in compliance with the law.
Yeah, at least with this one, we have some bright lines. I think the 18 is a bright line. You're either 18 or you're under 18. You have the categories of 16 to 17 and 14 and 15 that you got to pay attention to. So at least there's some areas that all you need to know is what you're dealing with, and then you can get the information you need fairly quickly. With respect to the registration, we just have to see how that's set up.
Yeah. Our our current work permit's valid through 10/26. Well, I don't know. Our work permits, I don't know how work permits generally work. Do they have expirations on them, Mike? Are they through the school year? Are they?
They work permits are once they're issued for the duration of the employment. And so once the employment ends or the volunteer ends, that work permit has to be returned to the school currently.
Okay.
So that's when the expiration, they don't go on indefinitely.
Oh,
Once the
okay.
employment situation ends, it has to be returned, or when they turn 18, it's no longer applicable. Now, what the other question, do you need a new work permit if somebody has work permit under the 1978 law, do you need a new work permit now because of the effective date of April 2nd? The answer is no. That doesn't come into effect until October of next year. So the work permits currently don't need to be replaced. But once that employment relationship is severed, then that work permit not only expires, it's got to be returned.
Okay. Okay. So Paul, that's if anybody working for you or volunteering for you right now, as long as they continue to do so, they're good till 10/26. Okay. I think it looks like we are good. Mike, as always, thank you so much.
No, I'm happy to help.
Thanks. Um, okay, thank you, everybody. I hope everybody has a great weekend with some sun and you get a chance to just kind of rejuvenate and relax.